Hi, I'm Cathy Tombaugh. I'm so glad you're here. I'm excited today to welcome Patrick Doyle, who's going to talk about his coaching and counseling work that he does with families using the Community Reinforcement and Family Training Program, or CRAFT, which is an approach that I have found to be so helpful. So let me tell you a little bit about Patrick. Patrick Doyle has been working with both families and individuals suffering from substance use disorders, depression, and other behavioral health issues for 30 years. He earned a Master's of Social Work degree in 1986 from Boston College and is a licensed independent clinical social worker in Massachusetts. Patrick followed the NASW Code of Ethics. Patrick is a qualified substance abuse professional according to US DOT regulations. And in addition to working as a senior clinician at employee assistant programs, Patrick has provided coaching in his independent practice. Patrick served for several years as a substance misuse consultant for the Boston Red Sox organization. So I'm so glad to have Patrick here, who's going to share details and information that I think you'll find very helpful. So welcome, Patrick. I'm really glad you're here and can't wait to hear about your thoughts and ideas about the CRAFT approach, community reinforcement and family training, because I know it's been just a really helpful approach for families. But before I do that, tell me about you. How did you get started in this? What's your background?
Sure. Thanks, Kathy, and thanks so much for this opportunity. As you know, there are so few people who are even aware of CRAFT, and that it's great to meet a comrade who is trained and skilled, such as you are. I always find that when I have a conversation with someone like you, who is using CRAFT, I always get excited, and we connect on so many different levels, because if you use it, you love it because it works, you know. So thanks so much for this opportunity. And with CRAFT, I'll give you the short version of my life story. I became interested in the mental health and addictions field as I came out of adolescence. And so I was raised in a family where there was a lot of love, but there was also a lot of stress. And it was a difficult family to grow up in sometimes. So I hit adolescence, developed depression, and which increased. And then once I had gone off to college, I basically got into treatment for depression. And thank goodness that I did, because a year of pretty intensive treatment, and ever since then I've been in recovery. And so getting out of undergraduate and getting involved in psychiatric treatment and seeing my own recovery, it just like floored me how psychiatry can work and counseling and medications can really work. So I got a job in the field. I started working on an inpatient. It was a psychiatric unit that also did a lot of work with substance use disorders. So in effect, it was a dual diagnosis program. Although back then, we didn't use the term dual diagnosis, but that's exactly what it was. The two populations were mixed in the same community hospital. And it was a wonderful experience. So I learned how to start working with people with addiction, people with depression, etc. And I loved it. Got a social work degree, master's in social work after that. And part of my training in social work school was it was at McLean Hospital in Massachusetts. And the social workers at McLean, they meet with the families. And the families are very much involved in the residential treatment of their loved one. And so I saw the power of getting the family involved in treatment, getting collateral information from the family, and also running treatment plans by the family, especially with discharge plans. And these days, very few places do a good job at discharge planning from residential addiction treatment back to the community. So I saw the power of all this and just fell in love with the field. So I've been working as a clinical social worker with families, with individuals, and I've always been drawn towards addiction. And I don't know, maybe it's because they're the most highly stigmatized patient population. And I've always been drawn to an underdog. I've always been the underdog. So I felt like they were my people, right? And started doing, I did an outpatient psychotherapy practice for many years in addition to an agency job. And then I became interested in life coaching and started working with families with addiction about 5 years ago as a life coach, which allowed me to do the work by phone. I could work across state lines because it's not regulated. So a lot of the barriers that are in place for psychotherapy, for psychiatry, we found ways around that. So we could have family meetings, even if the family was scattered across the country, by using a conference call. So as I was doing the work, and it was so gratifying because it met such a need. As you know, Cathy, families are underserved, they're undervalued, they're underrecognized, they're kept out of addiction treatment, even though that we know that involving the family in treatment improves outcomes dramatically. So I saw I was getting tremendous results. And I've always been in love with craft. I've always been drawn to the craft method, kindness, compassion, and loving communication, not turning our backs on our loved ones just because they have an illness. Mm-hmm. And, but I didn't take the formal craft course with Dr. Bob Myers until last March of 2021. And I took it with him. I also took Center for Motivation and Change's individual Invitation to Change program, which I loved as well, which is based primarily on craft. And so after taking the craft training, I decided, well, maybe I'll go for the certification. And I love the training. Certification was challenging. And so basically, we have to record our interviews, our coaching sessions with families, where we are training the families in the 9 different areas of craft. And so one has to demonstrate mastery of all of the principles of craft and submit audio tapes with the permissions of the families, of course, to my craft supervisor, who would then grade it and see if I met the requirements. Wow. And it was a labor of love, because it's very technical. But in December, after working at it for about 9 months, I finally passed all 9 sections and became certified in the craft method as a clinician. And there were some sections, I will admit, that I had to go back and do, not even just a second time, but a third time, because it is very specific. And in fact, it was the positive communication section that was the most challenging for me to nail that down. So I would go back to my families and I would be recording again. But what I will say, after going through that experience, going for certification, it really helps to learn the material, because you have to demonstrate that. And the other nice thing was that I found with my families, the families were finding it so useful. And we were seeing tremendous results in as few as 3 sessions, for the families improving their quality of life, but also their loved ones with addiction. They were coming around. And just real briefly, I'll give you an example. One family, I was working with the parents. They had an adult son in his 30s who had a severe level of alcohol use disorder for a good 15 years. And the son had been in many different residential programs for about 15 years altogether. Never was able to abstain from alcohol for more than 2 weeks at a time. So the family found me, reached out to me, and I started training the family in craft, being very specific. And the family gets homework assignments to work on in between the sessions. And that's also a good thing. And practicing the role playing with the family, it gives them skills, it gives them tools that they can use. So in working with this family, after 3 sessions, the parents described how for the first time in 15 years, their son, who was living with them, came to them and asked for help with his drinking problem. In 15 years, he had never asked for help from them. So that was a miracle. And what had happened was that the parents were changing their approach. And instead of voicing their frustrations and their concerns and trying to help him get into treatment programs, they changed, and they started having open-ended kind of conversations and trying to understand what was behind their son's alcohol use, the compulsive alcohol use. And they learned how to just encourage him and to positively reinforce or praise him for anything positive that he did. And they found that not only did he start asking for help and getting involved in treatment, but the parents, the way I can best express it, it's hard to say, but they refound their love for their son, and which was amazing, because instead of going and when the son was sleeping late and staying in the bed, maybe making a sarcastic comment, which is understandable, they might sit down and they might say, "How are you doing? Is there anything I can do to help?" And by helping the parents focus on any positive behavior that the son was showing, it helped them find the love for him that they always had, but I guess they lost sight of it, And so hearing their interactions in the home that had become so loving and so supportive, it was really powerful. And I've never seen anything quite like it in all the years and all the work I've been doing with families. So that was the second part. The families just found it so useful to be given the training of craft and to the homework assignments and put them into practice.
That's wonderful. And I love that story. And I know it's so rewarding to see a parent, who's so frustrated and so unhappy, and the child is cycling on and on and on, and to be able to come in with some tools and say, okay, let's look at this a different way. Because I think for parents, what happens is it just doesn't, I know for myself, it never occurred to me to think about positive reinforcement. That wasn't what occurred to me was, we have a problem and we need to fix it. And I think a lot of parents go through that too. It's just not something that comes up. So that's amazing. Well, congrats. I know that's a really challenging undertaking to go through that craft training or the certification rather. So that's great. Good for you. That's really good.
Thank you. It was indeed a labor of love. And I almost discontinued it. But that was the time that the family started saying things like, "This was exactly what I needed to learn today, and I can't wait to put this into practice."
Right.
And when you care, and the families you're supporting say things like that to you, it's like you can't stop it, right? You just keep doing it. So that definitely happened.
Right.
And it transformed me too.
Right.
And go ahead.
No, I was just saying, so for people that don't really know what craft is, it is getting out there. I know we're trying, people that like craft and have been trained in craft, we're all trying to let's get it out to as much. But the people that are just still not clear about what it is, what can you get a few examples about what you would work with the parent on? You mentioned positive reinforcement is one, but what would be the difference between a traditional approach or maybe what a parent had been taught from, say, a counselor who was not craft trained to someone who is craft trained? What would be some of the differences, do you think?
Great questions. Unfortunately, the majority of the treatment industry in the United States is still using outdated approaches. They're still in the dark ages. And time after time, families and persons with addiction would say to me that, well, the families were advised that you cannot support your loved one with addiction. You have to kick them out of the house. You have to cut off any kind of financial support. You can't take their phone calls. And basically, the advice that they're still given is you've got to practice tough love, and you have to let them hit rock bottom. And there never was any evidence for that. There was never a good reason to do that. Sure, it worked for some people, but I cannot imagine how many people it did not work for and how many people that we lost in that process. And what families are telling me, that like the Johnson intervention model, or even detaching with love and not helping their loved one, a lot of families these days, they don't feel comfortable with that. But with the craft method of kindness and compassion and helping you stay involved, maintaining a loving relationship with that person with the addiction, that feels much more comfortable for them. They don't want to give up. And they know that if they're not there helping their loved one out as best they can, the risks of their loved one coming to harm are very high, especially with the fentanyl and the street supply and COVID. So the craft method, I'm finding that it works really well with families who don't want to give up, and they can't stand the idea of turning their backs. And what's different about craft than other approaches is that it's not enabling, unless you think of enabling as enabling a person to live. So craft will do that. It'll enable that person to live. It'll support that person's safety while time passes, and you hope that there's more motivation to get into treatment, to decrease their use, to gain health and recovery, basically. And that's what the families find really useful. The other thing is that craft families learn skills. And it's kind of funny now thinking back about my career. We always gave advice to families about what they should be doing, what they could be doing, without really thinking and appreciating how these are dramatic changes for the family. And they have to be taught the skills to do that. For example, positive communication. Well, I learned more about positive communication from taking craft and getting certified than I had all of my past life. And that's the beauty of craft, is that parents learn skills. They learn different behaviors. They learn how to communicate positively, how to make I statements to keep the focus on them and their feelings, and how to demonstrate understanding to that person with the addiction, and to learn more about addiction, and then to give an offer of help, but not an offer of help that the family thinks would be the good thing to do, although that is natural, but leaving it open-ended and asking the person with the addiction, what can I do to help? And so I think that's a key difference. What we do know is that patients who make their own decisions about healthcare, they tend to do better. They have better outcomes. Even if we clinicians don't think that they're making the best choice, they do best when we support them making their best choice.
That's excellent. I agree. And I really like that idea. I've always loved that question of what can I do to help, rather than coming in and saying, this is what I think you need, and this is what I want you to do. So that's wonderful. Yeah. And the positive reinforcement and the positive communication, and just taking a breath and trying to kind of look at the big picture rather than diving in, reacting, more
Right.
taking time to just think it through a little bit. So wonderful.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think that's good. And it's hard. And I think the one thing too, sometimes I think about that detaching, letting go. And there's parts of me think, well, it is easier to just, I'm done. There's nothing I can do, but what's the result of that going to be? So craft
Right.
does take a little bit of effort and time on the parents' part, but everyone I've talked to and when I've worked with them, everyone is happier. Everyone's feeling a little more positive with craft. I don't know if
Yeah.
you find that too.
Yeah. 100%.
Mm-hmm.
And again, and I suppose that's how they end up, talking with me.
Mm-hmm.
They haven't been satisfied with the different approaches that they were recommended before. It doesn't make sense to them. So they don't want to give up, and they believe in their loved one, and so they're willing to do the work, and the work becomes it reinforces itself because they get such benefits from it. So they love it, and they love doing the homework, and they love doing the practice role plays, and I'm not a role play kind of person.
Yeah, I'm probably
And
not really so much either, but yeah, but
yeah,
if it
yeah, I
works.
mean, yeah, exactly. And with me getting advice and guidance from my craft supervisor in the program, that helped me be more skilled in leading the role plays and the reverse role plays. And that's how people learn, is to practice, practice, practice.
Right, right. Yeah, good point. Good point. Okay, so Patrick, give me an example, or what are your thoughts on families that go through this and then possibly get their child into treatment and they're all excited and everything's great, and then they come home and then a week later or 2 weeks later, a month later, whatever it is, they think substance use has started, or it's really clear that there's been a relapse or a slip or whatever. And I know for parents that's just devastating, because you're kind of thinking, oh my gosh, we're through this now and we're on to better places, and
Right.
then they go back. So how can you use craft in a situation like that to what would you suggest for a parent? How can they approach their child, and what would be a next steps possibly if a relapse is happening?
Right. And my sense is that I mean, if there's not a strong point of craft, is that I think craft can bring you to that point of, in 70% of the situations, you can encourage your loved one to get into treatment. And so craft is really good up to that point. I'm not, I haven't gotten much yet from craft about what you do beyond that.
Mm-hmm.
But that's okay. And what I do, and what I'm sure you do as well, Cathy, is that we offer ongoing coaching services and relationships to the families, because they will need it. A lot of times they will need it. So when they see that their person has resumed use, they need the support. They need to try to figure this out, and it's hard not to lose heart. It's hard not to feel discouraged when you see that happen. So they need someone like craft trained coaches who will help them realize that all is not lost. Staying in the moment and looking at what we have now is really useful for these families, especially when someone has resumed use. And they also need help to recognize all the gains and all the recovery that has happened already. And just because a person has resumed use doesn't mean that they are going back to square one, and they're back in the bottom of a deep pit again, like it might have a year ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And I've seen this, and that's another difference with the traditional addiction treatment industry, is that they describe it as you're back to square one. You've only got 1 day of sobriety. You got to start it all over again. But what we've seen is that people, even people who are using, can demonstrate significant recovery and better judgment, so that it helps them get back into a recovery sooner. And and I see more that they pick up where they left off. They're not starting all over from scratch again. They are continuing their recovery journey, and they've learned all these lessons, and they've learned a maturity. So it's that's the tough thing, is to reach out and provide help and support and education to the families when they do hit a rough patch in the future.
That's good. And I agree that I really like that also, the part about not feeling like you have to start all over again. You're starting at square one. I appreciate that so much. That, I mean, I can imagine how frustrating that would be. And it's kind of, you know, as you were saying that, I thought it is kind of like riding a bike. And a lot of these kids, they know the skills, they know what they need to do. It's just really the process of picking themselves up and starting again and trying it one more time. And, you know,
Yeah.
so.
And we see it all the time, right, Cathy?
Right,
I
yeah.
mean, we see people who resume use, and then at some point, and maybe not after very long, they get back on their feet and they get back into a recovery mode. And so it's a part of the illness for many people.
Right.
One thing I will also add is, there was another family that I was working with, and they had a sibling who was in her 50s, who had finally agreed to treatment and was in residential treatment. And I stayed in contact with the family, because the family still needs support when their loved one is in treatment. In this particular situation, their sister, who was in her 50s, they would call her on the phone at the program, and she would say she was fine. There was nothing wrong with her. She didn't have an alcohol use disorder, and she was going to get discharged early because she was doing so well. So the families would say to me, "We're so upset. She's not benefiting at all from this, and we're so frustrated. We want you, Patrick, to tell the treatment team at that facility that what she's saying to us. They've got to nip this in the bud," right? And they needed me to say, "Okay, guys, take a step back. I mean, if you think about it, a week ago, she was refusing to go to residential treatment. And now she's in residential treatment, and she's made an agreement to stay for 2 weeks. And okay, so you guys think she needs a month or longer. Maybe she does, but she's there, and she hasn't left, and she's agreed to 2 weeks. Look at where you were a week ago. This is fantastic." And it's a long race. So the families really benefited from having an expert who could reframe that for them, and then they could take a deep breath, and they could just let it be. And I coached them. I said, when she starts talking trash like that, I would discontinue the conversation and just say, "I love you. You're doing great. Keep up your great work. I'm looking forward to a time when you'll be back home again." And they learned how to do that, but they needed a lot of support.
So sure, absolutely. I know people, these different situations come up, and parents, it's hard, how do we respond? So that is wonderful. Thank you so much. Patrick, just one final question. What last words do you have for parents that are just finding out their children are using substances, or, starting to get dependent on drugs or alcohol? Do you have any final thoughts for them, or just tips for those beginning stages when you're trying to seek help and that kind of thing?
Yeah. Don't panic. Reach out for help. Reach out for support groups. like Al-Anon, for example, or any kind of support group. Talk to your family physician about it, talk to your close friends, but try not to isolate with it. I think there's a natural human response that we don't want other people to know. We wonder if we were part of the problem. So the first session of the CRAFT program, we emphasized to parents that, no, you didn't cause this, and you're not to blame for this. You're not responsible for this addiction. And I've seen situations where families did not feel like they could talk about this to other people because everybody's got an opinion. Everybody would give them advice and tell them that they were doing it wrong. And so the families tend to go underground, and that makes it really hard. So find people that you feel comfortable with, who are positive and are giving you positive energy and that are supporting you in your journey. Don't be afraid to get professional help. Contact CRAFT, learn about professional coaches, and reach out, and just try not to isolate, and try to learn all that you can about addiction and about how it impacts the family.
That's great advice. No, perfect. I love that. That's great. So tell us how people can find out more about you. So if they would like your services, or to find more about, what you're doing. I know you have a podcast on your website I saw as well. So that's exciting. Yeah, good.
Yeah. I'm excited about the podcast. So they can reach me at familyaddictioncoach.com.
Okay.
My phone number, my email link to ask for help is there. So familyaddictioncoach.com. I love getting feedback about the podcasts, and I just released episode 15, and it's a pro tips type of nuts and bolts guidance on, in fact, the first one that I just released is how to recognize addiction, how to identify addiction in your loved one, and what addiction is and what addiction is not. And I think it's got some great information that will surprise a lot of people. For example, you don't need dependency to have addiction, and you don't need addiction to have dependency on a chemical. And I'm thinking in particular about people with chronic pain who need opioid pain medications to manage their chronic pain in order to have any quality of life. And yeah, if you take opioids for a certain amount of time, you will develop dependence, but that's not the same as addiction, the compulsive use of a substance despite negative consequences. So and I love to talk with people, and I love families. I love families with addiction. I love persons with addiction.
That's nice. That's nice. I think you're the first person I've ever heard that's actually really said it like that. I love that. That's great. So definitely check out what Patrick's doing. Check out his podcast. Thank you so much for joining today, and and congrats on your certification. That's wonderful, and for all you're doing to help families. I think this evidence-based approach to me makes so much sense, and it's exciting to see it's really starting to take hold, I think, more and more in the United States.
Thank you so much, Cathy. And you can't argue with results, and it works.
Mm-hmm. So true.
So thank you for this opportunity.
Okay. Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.